and to tell you that this is part of UPSE and PSED's extension program, and that actually we have a number of other trainings in the pipeline. So you might be interested in that as well. So I would suggest na you watch out for those other trainings that will be offering in the next months. So aside from R, we might be offering trainings as well for Stata, Python, other software that you might find useful in your own lines of work. And well, actually, yun lang ano. I'm sure you're all excited to begin the training for today. By the way, this is also being live streamed on YouTube. Pero we're still sorting out yung link dun sa YouTube. So we're recording the morning session in the meantime, pero yung afternoon session, hopefully we can fix that already. And I'm only here as well to tell you that for those who might be interested to take up graduate studies at the UP School of Economics, we're now accepting applications for the intake for the upcoming academic year 2022 to 2023. So meron tayong tatlong degree programs offered at the school, yung Master in Development Economics, yung a Master of Arts in Economics, and then later yung PhD in Economics after your MA or MDE. So ayun, if you want to learn more about our graduate programs, you can visit graduate.econ.upd.edu.ph. And siguro some of you might be interested. Please send in your applications on or before February 28. Medyo maaga yung ating admissions deadline, application deadline for this year. But yeah, we're more than happy to inform you of the details. If you have questions, you can also email us at graduate@econ.upd.edu.ph. Okay, yun lang naman, Adrian. Good morning ulit sa lahat, and hope you have a very productive session this day. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, JC. So we have a busy schedule today. Let's get started. First, let me introduce our speaker for this day. Today's training will be handled by Ms. Charlene Siloso. She's a BS Statistics graduate in 2015 and Master of Statistics graduate in 2018 from the UP School of Statistics. She graduated magna cum laude in 2015. She was a former assistant professor at the UP School of Statistics, and currently she is research associate at the Philippine Statistical Research and Training Institute. So without further ado, let us all welcome our trainer for today, Ms. Charlene Siloso. Charlene.
Thank you for that introduction, Sir Adrian, and thank you for the warm welcome to Sir JC. So I'm just going to share my screen.
Charlene, sorry. So
Yes.
Before we begin, may I request everyone who are willing to open their cam for a class picture? Ayan, so okay. First picture, 1, 2, 3, smile. And then one more. One, two, three, smile. Ayan, okay na, Charlene. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so yung training natin for today and on next Saturday, basically, I divided it into 4 sessions. So yung morning today, afternoon today, and next week, yung morning and afternoon. So think of them as chunks that contain similar topics. That's how I designed yung program for these training sessions. So for the first session, basically it's about getting to know R and R Studio. These are the tools talaga na magiging pinaka-building blocks natin as we go along with the sessions. So yes, it's just really going to be getting to know R and R Studio for this morning. Now, I know that I've designed yung topics, keeping in mind yung pace na I really intend to cover them, all of these topics. So baka medyo mahaba tingnan na I have 4 subsections, but I think I could cover them all this morning. But in case na I need to make some adjustments, of course, to accommodate na perhaps some of you need more time to absorb the topics, I think we're quite flexible in that regard. Pero yun yung goal natin, cover everything this morning. And I was able to get some information about your profile. So I saw that some of you medyo may experience na with R, some of you are really beginners. Some of you may not have experience with R, but you have experience using other statistical software. And of course, you also come from a wide variety of fields, iba-iba yung mga fields of work ninyo. But besides that, so before we begin, I want to get something more specific. So I want to know something more specific about your skills. So let me just set this up. Okay, so please go to menti.com and use the following code. So you can go to this website even sa mobile phones nyo or in your laptops. And please expect that I'm going to use this website from time to time during our session. So we're going to have some interactive elements in the session kasi, of course, this is done remotely. And this is my way to check up on you from time to time to see if nakaka-keep up pa ba tayo with the topics or whatnot. So please go to menti.com and use this code. So the one that's flashed on the screen right now. And I want to know, are you proficient in using the following tools specifically for analyzing data? So I have 4 tools presented here: MS Excel, SPSS, Data, and Python. So pwedeng not at all. And on the other end is yes, na talagang gamay nyo kung paano sila gamitin for analyzing data. So I'm seeing right now, most of you talagang MS Excel yung familiar sa inyo. So some are familiar with SPSS and Stata, and quite a few are familiar with Python. So majority ay hindi familiar sa Python. So Stata, SPSS, medyo pantay, and MS Excel. Yun talaga yung familiar for most of you. So keeping that in mind, I'll try to connect. I'll try to connect yung parang how you would have done it in Excel and paano kaya sa R. We'll try to jump off from that. Okay, so thank you for your participation in this quick poll. So I'll be using this code for the whole morning session. I'll be using yung Menti code na yan. So pwedeng hindi nyo muna i-close yung window or yung tab which contains this page. So for the first chapter of this session, we're going to know more about R and RStudio. Ano nga ba si R? And ano din si RStudio? So why were you asked to install both of them? Bakit hindi lang isa, di ba? So you might be wondering. R basically is the programming language. And well, the official description talks about it as a free software environment for statistical computing and graphics. Basically, it's a language, pero you can think of it as an environment na, yun nga, ang dami kasing tools that you can use within R. So with R, you can perform a wide variety of statistical and graphical techniques as listed here. So some of them might be performed with R as installed out of the box. Some of them might be performed by installing what we call packages or add-ons to R. So for this morning session, we're just going to work with R as it is. We're not going to install anything else. Walang add-ons or packages na tinatawag muna. So what else can R perform? So R can also handle and store data. It also has various operators and also tools for data analysis and for performing, or rather for producing graphs. And as well as the language itself is considered to be simple and effective. So for those of you who know other languages, you might draw some analogies, no, na parang what you can do in Python may be done similarly in R, or maybe something that you can do in Stata can be done similarly in R. May mga similarities, pero you're going to observe big differences as well if you're familiar with other programming languages. And one thing that sets R apart from other programming languages is how it's really developed, keeping in mind yung pag-handle ng data. You're going to observe that, na parang that's the main aim of using R. So the way it was developed talaga is data-oriented compared to other programming languages that might be a little bit more general. So I'm assuming that you have successfully installed R, but still I'm just presenting this recap of instructions. So there's this website which contains various installers for R. And then depending on your computer's operating system, you can download R. So I see it a counterpart in your operating system. So let's open and explore R. So once you've installed R, you're going to see, so for Windows users, yung sa start, usually there's going to be 2 versions installed. So kindly open R. You would see something that has x64 next to it. So kindly open that. So let's get to know R first before we jump to RStudio. So makikita nyo na why is there a need to install something like RStudio? So why can't we just use R? So if you've opened R, kindly give me a thumbs up reaction here in Zoom. So yun then, please, I hope you're patient with me. I'm going to ask you from time to time to provide reactions since I can't physically see you. So yun, I'm going to ask often for reactions like this. Okay? And once you've opened R, you're going to see something like this. I would say, objectively speaking, that this doesn't look so user-friendly. That this looks, siguro if you're a beginner, parang it's quite intimidating na parang nandito agad sa ganyang klaseng display na it's somehow similar to the command prompt. Parang it looks like that. But technically speaking, you can work here. you can use R without installing RStudio. So kunyari here in this window, so this is called the console, as you can see dun sa may bar dito. So R console, you can perform simple calculations here. You can program here. So kunyari, I can perform something as simple as this, and I pressed enter, the result came out. So you can use this. Yun nga, you can use this. But I ask you to install RStudio because R itself, the way it looks right now, I would say it's not really beginner friendly. So that's where RStudio comes in. Okay, so yeah, I already briefly went through this, no, na it can be used like a calculator. So you can try to perform calculations like addition, division, and let me just go back to that, no. When R is expecting an input, it issues what we call a prompt, this one. So this means that R is ready to accept input. So if you're not seeing this, mukhang may kailangan pang gawin. So that's your sign that R is open to receiving input. Now, what is RStudio? Now, RStudio is an integrated development environment, or IDE for R. And ito lang, brief recap of the instructions for installing it. So the good thing about RStudio is that it's free. Although you might have seen from the website na may mga parang paid options, but even if we're just using the free version, it's fine. Madami na tayong pwedeng gawin despite it being free. Okay, so let's open RStudio. So kindly open RStudio and kindly give me a thumbs up reaction if you've opened it successfully. Okay, so thank you for those who have already reacted, and I'm going to wait a bit. I think may ilan pang hindi nakakapag-open. So what you're seeing in my slides might not be exactly the same as what you're going to see once you open RStudio. So perhaps may minimal na difference in terms of the layout. Kasi once you open RStudio, especially kung binubuksan nyo pa lang siya for the very first time, what you might see looks like this. Ganito. So if you might have observed in my slides, kanina, the one that I have there, mukhang may 4 na divisions, but this one only has 3. So let's get to know ano yung mga parts na yun and saan nanggaling yung 4th na portion. So let me walk you through the basic interface of RStudio. The one that you're seeing here, itong pinakamalaking part, this is actually similar to what we saw from R a while ago. So this is also called the console, similar to how it's called kanina when we were using R and not RStudio. So from now on, we're going to work here in RStudio. You may close R. So yung binuksan natin kanina, you may close it now. We're not going to use it anymore for the rest of the sessions, and we're going to fully work here on RStudio. Okay, so this is the console, and similar to R a while ago, you can also perform yung mga operations here in the console. And also, remember yung kanina na may ganitong tinatawag na prompt, which expects expects input from us, ganun din. So you can perform yung mga simple operations also. And the outputs are instantaneously displayed. So once you perform something, yung output, you get it right away. But sometimes we don't want to work like that. Now, sometimes we want to code or to type in everything, and then parang, let's say we want to run things line by line, or we want to run things as a batch or as a whole. So paano yun? And that's where a fourth window will be helpful. So go to File, New File, and then our script. Or you have this button here, itong may plus, and then there's a white square. You can also use it. So create a new R script, and that will give you this fourth window. So yan, parang may apat na tayong quadrants dito. We can think of it that way. So this portion is called the source window. And we can type codes here for future use. And if we type our codes, hindi pa sila ini-execute right away. So we're just typing, we're not running them yet. And of course, you see this button, you can use this to run codes later on. So for those of you who've worked with a programming language before, di ba na minsan na you want to code or to type in everything bago i-execute. So ganun din, there's an option to do it, and it's here in the source window. Now, what are the other parts? So this portion, we have the environment. So this is one thing that RStudio does better than yung R na super bare lang a while ago. With this environment, we get to see mamaya yung tinatawag na objects. So we're going to create objects, and here, dito sa environment, they will appear here later, and it gives us an idea of the objects that we can use. So at least we are aware na I have this object pala, and I can use or call this object eventually. And then history, this is helpful if you want to run again yung ibang lines ng code that you've run previously. So yan, you can notice I have a lot of codes that I've previously used. And ayun, may access kayo to that. Then connections, we're not really going to use this for now. So hindi pa relevant yan for the level of discussion for our sessions. And then here at the bottom, we also have several useful tabs. So files, so that one can be used to access files from a particular folder. And then plots. So next Saturday, you're going to learn how to create plots, and you're going to see them here. And then packages, ito yung mga kino-consider as add-ons to R. We're not going to use them today yet, but you're going to learn about them in the next session on February 5. And then help. So this is what I also like about R, na even if wala kayong access sa internet, so you're just using this on your computer, medyo extensive yung documentation niya. You don't have to go online to get help or to know more about a particular function or a particular tool in R. So yan, kita nyo sa aking help na I previously looked into this particular tool. And then viewers, so this is not yet relevant for the level of discussion, but if you create yung mga mas advanced na objects, kasi may ways sa R to create things like dashboards or mga interactive na visualizations, they will appear here and not dun sa plots. So si plots talagang pictures lang na static, but viewer is more of dun sa mga medyo dynamic na objects. So that's basically the 4 major parts of RStudio. And by having those parts, I would say it makes the experience more user-friendly or even beginner-friendly compared to R itself. So that's why I ask you to install RStudio. Now, ito pa yung maganda about RStudio. You can do some basic customization if, let's say, you want to change how RStudio looks like. Let's say you don't like the default font, or the default font size is too small for you, or perhaps you're more of a dark mode person, like I am. So let me just go back to that, and tools, you're going to see global options. And then you can go to this part, itong appearance. Yan, maraming choices. So you can change the font, you can change the font size, and you can change the theme. So Dreamweaver is the default. Tapos may mga dark mode. So for now, I'm using the default setting para mas malinaw sa screen. And then I'm just going to increase the font size a little bit. Gawin ko lang siyang 14. So kindly thumbs up if you were able to follow it. So yun, feel free to customize para better yung experience natin. Yung minsan parang we feel na talagang we're into programming kapag something na dark mode or yung mga fonts na medyo ganito yung itsura. So feel free to customize. And don't forget to click on OK so that the changes are applied. Ayan, so even sa console na-apply yung change, lumaki yung font size. So I asked you a while ago to create a new R script, and that gave us yung window on the upper left portion. And a script is basically a text file containing a set of commands. So commands, yun yung i-execute natin that will produce an output. And we can also add comments. So the good thing about adding comments is that it gives us an idea of the portions of our codes. Kasi as we go through our session, expect that we're going to have several lines of codes. And let's say you open that file again after a few months, baka hindi nyo na alam, di ba, na tungkol ba saan yung code. So what does this particular portion try to do? So that's where the comments will be helpful. We're going to put comments later. And kayo din, so feel free to put your own comments later. I'm going to teach you how to do that. So the R scripts can be edited and saved. And of course, if needed, you can open it at a future time. So to create a new script, we did this a while ago, and you can familiarize yourselves with the keyboard shortcuts. So yung mga ganong keyboard shortcuts will be helpful if you want to work faster. So some of us prefer to work that way. Some of us talagang mahilig sa keyboard shortcuts. And some of us prefer yung point and click, and that's fine. So that's also one advantage of RStudio. So there are several things in RStudio na pwedeng i-point and click. And do not forget to save your scripts. So let me go back to this. As you can see, untitled pa siya. So even if we don't have anything typed in this script yet, i-save natin siya. So I highly recommend na sana may folder kayo that's used particularly for this training, na yun talaga yung purpose niya. And I'm going to save my codes. So I'm going to save my codes as day 1, tapos morning. Then we're going to have separate codes later for the afternoon session. Yan. Can I see a thumbs up if you were able to save your R script file? So please don't forget to save from time to time. The usual keyboard shortcuts in saving, yun din naman yung ginagamit dito. So the typical Control S for Windows users. That's also what we can use. So mamaya we're going to see something about this window then that's going to help us know na, uy, mukhang kailangan ko nang i-save yung code. Kasi 'di ba, sabi ko nga, don't forget to save your codes or your scripts from time to time. Pero ang maganda with RStudio, there's a visual cue that somehow tells you na mukhang you need to save your code. So we're going to see that shortly. So now it's time to put some commands in our script. So kindly type itong 4 portions na to, itong 4 lines na to. So type muna natin, mamaya na natin alamin what they do and ano nga ba yung pina-perform nitong mga to na mamaya na natin alamin. Let's just type them. So let's not run them first. Type lang muna. So I'll give you some time to do that. So once you've done it, yung 'di ba may reaction dito sa Zoom na yung parang yes, yung parang green na may check mark. So kindly press that kasi mas nagtatagal siya. So mas matagal siyang mawala compared to the thumbs up para I can assess better kung gaano na kadami yung nakakasunod since compared to what we've done a while ago, medyo matagal 'to gawin compared to those things. So that I know kung may hinihintay pa tayo. Okay, so quite many of you have done this pero may ibang hindi pa, okay lang. So I'm going to wait a little bit more since I think some of you have arrived ng bago-bago lang. So please open our studio for those who are just catching up, who just joined us. So for those who just joined us, the link to the YouTube stream was sent in our chat and you'll be able to catch up naman. So we're going to have breaks naman and you can seek dun sa timeline sa YouTube so that you can catch up to those parts na hindi nyo naabutan. Okay. So how do we run these lines? And ito pala yung sinasabi ko. This is what I was describing a while ago. A while ago, when we had nothing typed here, black yan. So now that we've implemented some changes, ang dami nating nilagay, it's red and may asterisk na ganyan. So this indicates that your current file is unsaved. So if I press yung keyboard shortcut to save or you can use this, yung button na yan, yun. Bumalik siya dun sa black. This means that all changes have been saved. So it might be helpful from time to time to check how this looks like. So na-save ko ba yung latest progress ko or not? By the way, segue ko lang din. So we're about to run yung mga codes na to. One option is using this button and meron siyang keyboard shortcut. And to know about all the other keyboard shortcuts, if you go to tools, eto may option, keyboard shortcuts help. And you can see all of the available keyboard shortcuts. So napakadaming pwedeng gamitin for some of you na who might prefer using keyboard shortcuts. So of interest to us is this portion, itong execute. Since our aim now is to run the codes that we have typed in our script window, and we want to see what they output. So in particular, what would be really useful, I would say, is yung Control Enter, which is to run the selected lines. So you can run pwedeng line by line. Actually, you don't even have to select. Let's say you want to run a single line. Just place your cursor on that line and ititreat niya na yung buong line as what you want to run or to execute. But if you want to run, let's say, all of these 4 lines, pwede din naman. So you can run a single line or you can run several lines. But for now, since we're going to know what each of these commands do, gawin natin siya in a line-by-line manner. So ito, ano nga bang ginagawa nito? So if you look at this one, we have A and something that looks like an arrow and then 5. So this is actually going to store the value of 5 to an object. I'm just going to call it an object generally, an object called A. So run natin. You can press this button or you can use the keyboard shortcut. So Control Enter. Anong nangyari? One sign that a certain line or certain lines of code have been executed successfully is if they appear in the console. So that's a sign. So ito, na-run siya successfully and the prompt is expecting another input from us. So it's open to another input from us. What happened? Unlike yung mga previous nating ginawa which had instantaneous output like this na nagkaroon ng answer agad, no? This one doesn't have an output na ganito. Instead, you would observe here in the environment, nagkaroon na siya ng laman. Whereas a while ago, it was totally empty. And what we see here, may object na tayo called A, and it has a value equal to 5. So yun pala yung ginagawa nung command na to. So before I move on to the next line, this one is actually what we call the assignment operator. If you're familiar with other programming languages, you might be used to using the equal sign. Kasi yun talaga yung default in other programming languages like in Python or even in Stata, di ba? So the equal sign also works in R. Pwede din naman. You can safely substitute yung equal sign dito sa ating assignment operator. But I would recommend that you get the hang of using this. Parang siya yung mas native talaga dun sa R. So I recommend keep on using the assignment operator. So of course, if we try to run this line, so you don't even have to highlight, kahit just place your cursor anywhere in this line, run natin siya. And we're going to get a similar outcome. This time, an object called B is stored and it has a value of 7. Now, the third line. For those of you who have programming experience, I think you might know what's going to happen. For those of you na wala, ano nga ba yung ginagawa ko dito? So this operator between A and B is used for multiplication. So I'm multiplying capital A with small b. And so once I've run that line, merong error message, object A not found. So this tells us that R is case sensitive when it comes to object names. It knows itong si small a, but not si capital A. So finally, when we go to our fourth line, this one, run natin yan, we're going to see the output. We get 35. So at this point, I also want to emphasize na in certain commands, you won't get to see yung output computed or displayed in the console. Kagaya nitong first two lines natin kanina. And what it executed, parang nag-manifest siya in something else at hindi dito sa console. So it resulted in objects stored in our environment. But for operations, like this one, multiplication siya, talagang nagkaroon tayo ng output that was displayed instantaneously. So yun din, parang this is something that beginners tend to forget na parang tataka sila na, let's say, itong part na to, na A is 5, pero walang na-display dito. So for you to actually parang call or see si A, kailangan nyo siyang tawagin talaga for you to explicitly see yung 5 na yun. So ito, sinustore mo lang siya, but if you want to display it, kailangan mo siyang tawagin. So if you're just storing or assigning to an object, yun, walang instantaneous output. But if you're making computations or if you're calling an object, you get to see them in the console. Anyway, you'll get to know more or to, parang mas ma-internalize nyo pa yan as we go along. So were you able to follow that quick demo? Kindly thumbs up if yes. All right. So some more remarks about executing codes in a script in R. So notice the output appears in the console window, the one on the lower left. So some other options that we can try to see are the following. You may use the up and down arrow keys to see the previous commands that you have used. I mentioned a while ago yung pane or tab on the upper right part, the one called history. Now you can use it if you want to go back to the codes that you've previously used. But this is also a quick option. In case na yung codes are something that you've used na talagang kani-kanina lang. But if you want to reuse codes that you've used a long time ago, it may be better to use the history tab. Pero kung recent talaga, up and down arrow keys may be used. And also what's good about R, not only in R, hindi lang to additional option ng RStudio. So this is native talaga in R, that if you have entered an incomplete command, it will show us the plus symbol. And it gives us the chance to complete the command. And if you want to cancel the incomplete command na parang it was just a mistake and you don't really want to complete it, you can press the escape key. So subukan natin. So let's go back to RStudio. So dun tayo sa console, dito sa lower left. If you use your up and down arrow keys, ayan no. So I can go through the codes that I've run previously. Ayan, di ba? So it's easy to navigate kapag, let's say, may gusto kayong gawin ulit. May gusto kayong i-double check, di ba? So pwede gawin easily by using the up and down arrow keys. Now, ano yung sinasabi about incomplete commands? Let's say I type A times tapos wala akong nilagay na iba pa. So A times what? Saan ko minumultiply si A? So instead of this symbol, yung tinatawag na prompt, di ba sabi a while ago, if you see the prompt, it means R is ready for new input. But that's not what I'm seeing. So if what you're seeing is the plus sign, it tells us that what we entered is incomplete. And R is expecting na i-complete natin yon. So pwede namang lagyan nyo ng B, tapos i-enter nyo. But in case parang avoid, di ba, na you want to cancel it all together, press your escape key and balik tayo sa prompt. So by doing that, R can expect new input. So if let's say gusto nyo pala talagang i-complete, edi ganun lang. But if not, escape key. Now, other things about making scripts. Now, comments. You may add comments by using the pound sign. And including comments is good practice kasi nga, it helps us understand what's going on. Lalo na nga if you have several lines of code and you want to be clear about what each part is doing. And in most instances, R doesn't care about spacing. And spacing will only really matter when we deal with objects in R that are considered to be characters. So mamaya we'll get to know kung ano ba yung mga objects that are available in R. And we're going to formally look at what characters are. And for those of you who are familiar with programming, yun din yung tinuturing na string, or basically text. So switching back to RStudio, let's say dito, I can add a comment na basic calculations. Pwede kayong mag-add ng mga ganyang comments as we go along. And don't forget to save your codes. So also mentioned a while ago, R doesn't really care, generally speaking, about spacing. Spacing matters sa characters. Spacing also matters when it comes to the assignment operator. Hindi pwedeng ganyan. So dapat talaga, they are together. Walang space in between. But then, let's say, gawin ko siyang ganito, it's totally fine. And it boils down to your preference. O di kaya, this one, I put some additional spaces, okay lang din. So we get the same, ganun din, na nagka-error siya, and ito, na-perform niya successfully. So it all depends on what you prefer. I think some people prefer na walang spaces kasi they want their codes to look more compact. Some people prefer to have spaces para hindi gaanong crowded tingnan, para medyo mukhang nakakahinga. I don't know, for some people ganun. Ako personally, that's my preference. I like to put spaces. Pero for some, hindi. And that's fine. R will still work. So what else do we have to know? Ayun, as I've mentioned a while ago dun sa help pane or tab, R has a very extensive documentation. So if you want to know more about the tools, let me go back to that. So kunyari, something about the mean, basic statistics, pagko-compute ng mean. So yun, pwede nyo siyang malaman dito. Na meron palang tool si R to compute the arithmetic mean, and it can be even generalized for the term mean. So even without going online, you can access that documentation. So that's the end of chapter 1, basically getting to know R and RStudio. Do you have any questions at this point? So just feel free to chat kung may questions. At the end naman of every chapter like this, meron naman tayong time for Q&A. So I would recommend na for the smooth flow of the discussion, na try nating ipunin yung questions dun sa point na dulo ng chapter. But if talagang may urgent concern, okay lang ha. So kung talagang may something na gusto nyong erase sa akin, just feel free to chat. Okay lang. You don't have to wait until the end. Pero kung parang something na medyo general curiosity, then ipunin natin dun sa dulo ng subsection. Okay, so nakakaisang chapter na tayo for this morning and we have 3 more to go, but don't worry, hindi naman ganun kahaba yung iba sa kanila and they're not of the same length. So don't feel intimidated na may 3 pa tayong chapters na bubunuin. So the second chapter, I think this is the longest because we're going to know about the objects in R. This is going to be, I would say, parang personally, I think this is the most boring part, but we're going to get to know these objects. We're going to talagang hihimayin natin what their characteristics are, what they're used for. so that you're prepared if kailangan nyo na siyang gamitin for more advanced features. I would say na it's good to have a solid foundation talaga na these concepts are solidified even before you move on to the more advanced concepts. So, kilalanin natin what are the things that we can create in R. And basically, everything produced by our R codes is considered as an object, and the objects that we create are reflected in the environment pane. And at this point, we've created two objects, si small a at si small b. So those are objects. I'm just calling them that way. But we're going to get to know ano nga ba yung mga specific objects na yun. So when we store objects in R, we assign names to them so that we can call them again. And names in R, as we saw a while ago, are case sensitive. Na yung command natin a while ago where capital A was multiplied to small b did not work because R doesn't know capital A. Kilala lang niya si A, which had a value of 5. So it is good practice to use descriptive names, but keep them short and simple. So usually kapag we're working with data sets, yung mga names natin can be the variables that we use. So make them descriptive, but don't make them too long. So siguro if you reach parang mga 20 characters, I think that's quite long na. So try to keep them brief, but descriptive. Now, when we're using yung mga objects, when we name them, spaces and special characters, except for underscore, are not allowed. So if you want to use 2 or more words in the object's name, connect them using an underscore. Let's say my underscore object. So hindi pwedeng my space object. Kailangan my underscore object. Now, an object's name must start with either a letter or a dot. And if it starts with a dot, the second character must not be a number. So, pwede to. Tapos kapag sa dot daw nagsa-start, the second character must not be a number. Pero I think, based on my personal experience, parang I seldom use or I never actually use object names that begin with dots. So it's good to have something that starts with a letter. So to connect two words, pwede ding ganito. So some people prefer using underscores, some people prefer using dots. So binura ko lang muna since we're not going to use them. Bine-demonstrate ko lang naman yung naming. Now, in R, there are certain reserved words and we cannot use them to name our objects. Kasi these words serve a specific purpose, a special purpose in R, and reserved na nga sila for that purpose. That's why we can't use them. So to get to know those reserved words, you can go to help and eto, meron na tayong nakikita dito na reserved. You can click on that and ayan, reserved words in R. So you can name your objects using these words. So please be careful. So before we really get to know the objects, we need to know the data types. These data types eventually will help us determine the type of object that we are creating. So we have the following data types: character, numeric, integer, complex, and logical. And to determine an object's data type, let's say we're not sure, there's a function called class. So in R, we have functions. Yung mga functions, they perform certain operations and the typical syntax looks like this. So yung command for the function, tapos you have parenthesis, wherein dun sa parenthesis, ipapasok nyo yung object na gusto nyong gamitan nung function. So let's say ito, yung class, and then inside the parentheses, you're going to input whatever object it is that you want to determine kung ano yung data type niya. So also one advantage of R, I would say, na compared to other languages, I think specifically for using it in data analysis, I think yung mga names of functions in R are very self-explanatory. So to compute the mean, edi use the mean function. Ganun lang. So that's also one advantage in using R for data analysis. Okay, so going into the first data type, character. Characters contain no numeric information, and when we work with them, they are enclosed in quotation marks. Even if you have a number stored as a character, R thinks of it as text. So if you have a number na tinitreat ni R as a character, you can perform mathematical operations in it kasi nga, R strips it of nung mga numerical information niya. Text lang talaga yung tingin niya. So for this example, let's check the output of running this simple line. So I'm going to put a comment dito. So character data type. And then we're going to use class. Tapos inside the parentheses, hello world. Ayan, yung typical first command na nirun nung iba, di ba, na yung aim nila typically is to output hello world. But we didn't do that. Instead, we're checking the class of this object. So, i-run natin yan. Again, feel free to use the keyboard shortcut or press this button. And we see character. So, kindly thumbs up if you were able to get this output. So, if something is enclosed in quotation marks like this one, there's no other answer that we're expecting. Character talaga yan. But in case for other objects na there's some confusion na hindi kayo sure ano ba talaga siya, so feel free to use the class function. So character. And if we have data na qualitative, expect they're stored that way. Now, similar to other programming languages, may kaibahan if we're dealing with integers or whole numbers and with numbers in general. So the second data type is called numeric, and they're commonly associated with real numbers. So for those not familiar with other languages, they might refer to this as double, which is stored with a double precision floating point format, or float. I think some languages call it that way. And then integer, well, simply refer to integers. So ito yung limit ng integers. Medyo mataas naman. But when you use numeric data, you can even have a higher limit. So keep that in mind. Let's say, meron kayong data na sure kayo it contains integers, but you think you're going to have values larger than this, then it will be safer to store your data as numeric compared to this. So yun, just be aware of the limits. Okay, let's check the output of this. Class and then 12. So this time around, it's not enclosed in quotation marks. So of course, we're not expecting this to be character. 12 in itself, it's clear to us this is an integer, but let's see. Let's see if indeed that's going to be the output. So I just put a comment, numeric and integer, and then check natin class ng 12. Okay, so 12 looks like an integer, but R doesn't automatically treat it that way. Okay, so by default, pag number, parang R is trying to be more careful. Sige, numeric na lang yan. I'm not going to assume na integer siya. So, paano magiging integer si 12? So, to explicitly define a whole number as an integer type, one way to go about it is to append capital L to it. This is not the only way. May iba pa. Pero for now, this is one easy way to define a whole number explicitly as an integer type. So if we try running class tapos 12 and we have capital L beside it, then we see integer na yung type niya. So that's the difference between numeric and integer. Now, these two types, I think we're not going to use them that often for our sessions. Yung logical medyo, but complex, totally we won't use this. But for the purposes of having a complete discussion of all data types, so I'm just going to briefly mention them. Okay, R can also deal with complex numbers. And similar dun sa knowledge natin about complex numbers in math, may two parts, the real and the imaginary part. So you can check this. Hindi ko na siya i-run since we're not really going to use it, but you can check that the class of this is going to be complex. And finally, logical. So logical values simply keep track of either true or false. And you can shorten, instead of referring to true na full word and false na full word, you can use capital T or capital F as long as they're not enclosed in parentheses. So pag enclosed in parentheses, R will think of it as a character. But if not, kagaya nito, so go back to our studio, logical, and then class of capital T, we get logical. Hindi kaya class ng false, also logical. So, clear ba so far yung data types? Kindly give a thumbs up reaction if you were able to follow the discussion. So when it comes to the data types, parang you can think of them in terms of the actual data that you're using. Na perhaps may data kayo na names tungkol sa mga pangalan, may ganun kayong information, so it would be character. Perhaps may data kayo about income, di ba? Numeric. Or perhaps may mga iba kayong ginamit na would fall under integer. So yung logical, this isn't something that we really encounter, let's say, in a data set. Na sometimes, yes, pero more often than not, mukhang hindi. But they have a different purpose. We're going to see that later. So ito na yung talagang mga objects. So given those data types, parang kapag meron na tayong, let's say, madaming numbers, madaming integers, madaming characters, and pinagsama-sama natin sila, what can we make? Kanina kasi when we were checking the class, laging isang bagay lang yung ini-input natin. But what if you combine them? So I have this table which shows you the basic data structures in R. And they may be easily categorized as follows. So first, think of the elements of that object. So we're going to deal now with objects that contain more than one value. Unlike kanina, going back to our RStudio window, kanina kasi ito lang, oh, so 5 lang yung stored sa A, isang bagay lang, 7 lang yung stored sa B. But what if we have several of them? So think of their data types. Are they homogeneous or not? So this portion deals with the dimension. So kapag one dimension and homogeneous, we have vectors. Pag one dimension and then halo-halo, so you can have numeric and character and whatever, na they can all interact in the same one-dimensional object, it's called a list. Kapag two dimensions, think of it as having rows and columns. Yung typical tabular data, pwedeng ganun. If it contains homogeneous elements, let's say they're all numeric, they're all character, o di kaya they're all integer or whatsoever, that's a matrix. Now, if we generalize it into a two-dimensional object that contains several data types inside, it's called a data frame. R treats it as a data frame. And that's how, ganyan naman yung karamihan ng tabular data that we typically work with. So, kunyari nagpa-survey kayo, then meron tayong data na yung rows natin, observations, yung columns natin would be the different variables. Let's say yung names, yung mga age, so on and so forth. And then you can even have more than two dimensions. But if you're just starting with R, I don't think you would really need this, pero you might need to use something which has more than two dimensions and array yung gagamitin natin. Unfortunately, an array can only contain homogeneous elements. And we'll go through these structures or these objects one by one. So ito na, we're going to combine more than one value into a vector. Kanina kasi isang number lang yung in-store natin. So what if madami na? So generally speaking, vectors are one-dimensional objects with homogeneous elements. So this is how the discussion will proceed for those data structures. So a reminder kung ano sila, yung in terms of dimension and in terms of the homogeneity or heterogeneity of elements inside them, paano sila ginagamit, an example, and some other remarks. Ganon yung general flow. You're going to see this pattern as we go along. So let's try this example. Let's create these vectors called V1 and V2. So please copy these two lines in RStudio and just signal with a thumbs up if you're done copying them. So sabay-sabay nating i-run sila para nakikita natin ano yung naging output. So kindly just signal with a thumbs up if you're done typing si V1 at si V2. Ito lang. Yung two lines lang na yan. Okay, I'm gonna switch to RStudio. And ito, si V1 and si V2. We can select the two lines. I-run na natin sila as a block. Okay? And you'll see that they are now displayed here in the environment. And somehow, the environment gives us an idea of the vectors class. Medyo may hint na, di ba, na ito character, ito numeric. And if you're not sure kung talagang gusto nyo i-verify, then you can easily use the class function. So the class of V1 is numeric. Then the class of V2, of course, is going to be character. If you've been observing also, isa din sa mga added features ng RStudio that make it more user-friendly is yung auto-completion niya. Let's say if you have parentheses, automatic gumagawa na siya nung closing parenthesis. And if you have quotation marks, ganun din, automatic na they come in pairs. So there's less chance of having errors due to yung mga kulang-kulang tayo with our parenthesis or with our quotation marks. Yun din. So if you place your cursor next to a closing parenthesis, makikita nyo yung kapartner niya. It's highlighted. So particularly helpful kapag meron na tayong mas complex na codes and you want to verify, lalo na kapag parang nested, parenthesis within parenthesis within parenthesis. So it's helpful in this manner. Now, I'm going to show this just to demonstrate. Paano kung, so C, remember, is the function used to create a vector. Paano kung ganyan? Look at what happened. May nagawa siya, but look at what happened to 1, di ba? So I'm going to discuss that concept formally later. So this is a teaser na bakit siya gumana, di ba? You might wonder, pero may nangyari. Gumana siya, but this one is not a number anymore. Sometimes we create vectors that can be easily created using some special commands. Let's say you want to create a vector consisting of integers from x to y, o di kaya baliktad. So let's say, alam ko naman na I want to create a vector na from 1 to 100. Or let's say, meron kayong data set and you want to create parang an ID label for your observation. So dapat 1 to 1,000 yan or whatsoever. And consecutive numbers or consecutive integers lang naman. So you can easily do that using this command. So 1 colon 100 or kung baliktad, 100 colon 1. So dina-demonstrate ko lang muna, no? I'm not storing it as a vector. I'm not saving it here. Pinapakita ko lang ano yung output of using this. So this is a vector, but it's not stored here. Meaning I cannot call it again if I want to display it. So kung gusto ko siyang i-display, talagang yung command mismo yung itatype ko. Unlike if it's in the environment, you can just use yung shortcut, yung pangalan niya, to display the elements. Okay, so yun yung difference. Ito, I'm not storing it here. I'm just demonstrating yung contents niya. And 100 to 1 is just the reverse. So you can use these commands if, yun nga, you're sure that this kind of vector is what you want to output or what you want to use. And one use case na naiisip ko is having a column or having something that indicates ID numbers kapag may dataset kayo. Di ba minsan ganun na pag may observations tayo, we want to label them na say observation 1, C2, so on and so forth. And I'm going to quickly go through these special functions na might be helpful din. And you will notice how their names are quite descriptive. First two functions, CREP at CSEQ. Tingnan natin how they're descriptive. So CREP, may nire-repeat. Let's examine what we need to input inside the parentheses. So this one will request for a vector which it will be repeating many times. The repetition may be done element-wise. Merong option na each or vector-wise may option na times. So tingnan natin yung difference. So ano yung ibig sabihin ng element-wise repetition or vector-wise? And meron din ganito na you already anticipate the length of the vector that you want. So ulitin mo to, but I want a result that only contains 8 elements. So tingnan natin kung anong mangyayari. Kindly type these 3 lines, tapos i-run natin. And again, just thumbs up if you're finished typing the 3 lines para ma-run natin. So please be careful, may mga commas, may mga equal sign. Okay, medyo may konti nang nagda-thumbs up, but it's okay, we can wait for others. Okay lang. Okay, I think we can now go to our codes and tingnan natin. So this first line, this will repeat this vector. Again, this is a vector, ito. So 1 up to 3. Ito yung laman yan. I-repeat niya element twice. So run natin yung line na to and ayun, element twice yung pag-repeat niya. So each element is repeated twice. Now, this one, yung times na option, will repeat vector-wise. So kung vector-wise and then 2 times, so ganyan naman. So depende na maybe you need this kind of repetition, perhaps ito. So keep in mind each kung ganito times kung ganito. And this one, if you're anticipating na I need 8 elements, so spread out natin or ulitin natin rather si 1 up to 3 over 8 elements. And of course, dahil hanggang 8 lang, tinatruncate niya na. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 hanggang 1, 2 na lang. So it's truncated at this point. So that's rep for repetition. Now si SEQ for sequence, it generates a series of numbers, technically an arithmetic sequence, starting at a certain number, ending at a maximum certain number, given a common difference. So may mga gantong keywords na may from, may to, tapos may by. I-type muna natin to. So you might wonder, sometimes may mga bagay sa R na kailangan mo talagang sabihin kagaya nito na by equals, tapos length.out equals. Tapos bakit ito? Parang gets na niya what this is for, or even this one, alam na niya kung ano yan. So we'll examine that later. But for now, kindly type these 2 lines. And then again, thumbs up if you're done typing them. Also, as you're working, you might notice na yung ibang commands, R can automatically complete it. Let's say si length.out, na parang may auto-completion na si RStudio. So you can just press enter, then natatype niya na yung buong command. Sige, let's just wait for a few more minutes for others to catch up. So, before we run the commands, emphasize ko lang yung pino-point out ko a while ago na bakit ito kailangan ko siyang gawing by equals to, tapos ito, bakit parang alam na ni R kung ano siya. In fact, there's an underlying name for this one, itong si 1 at saka si 20. And I've mentioned them in the slides, yung merong from at saka to, na innately, yun eh, na parang make a sequence from 1 to 20 by 2. Tapos make a sequence from 1 to 20 spread out over 25 elements. So let's examine SEQ dito sa help. So pag chinek nyo yan, you're going to see na talagang yun nga na may from tapos may to. So you can read the extensive description. Pero generally, if parang I would say, parang if an element, as a general rule of thumb, na if an element inside a function is parang siya yung non-negotiable, na sequence won't work kung wala kang from at saka to. Tapos nandun siya sa first portion nitong syntax. You can safely omit ito. So, we didn't put from equals, tapos to equals. Okay lang, gets na niya kung ano yon. But if it's an option na it's not strictly required, like this one, yung by, pwedeng wala naman siya, pwede namang let that out or whatever option, kailangan talagang ilagay kung ano siya na by equals. Na if you omit this, baka R might misunderstand what you want to achieve. Yun. Unlike this one na malinaw naman as 1 up to 20. Yun. So generally speaking, ganun siya mag-work. Na if it's in the first portion ng syntax and it's a non-negotiable thing for the function to work, pwedeng i-omit yung pangalan na ganun. But otherwise, you need to really say what it is. So by ba or let that out. So ito, sequence of numbers from 1 to 20 by 2. Anong makukuha natin? So 1, yung minimum ay 1, yung maximum ay 20, and increments of 2 by 2. But since 20 is our maximum, nag-stop na siya at 19. Now, ito. Let that out equals 25. Notice the number on the left side. This one indicates kung pang ilang element yung first na nakikita natin in that line. So this is the first element, this is the 7th element, this is the 25th element. We have an easy way to navigate through the vector. So over 25 elements, spread out yung 1 up to 20. So alam niya this is the minimum, this is the maximum, and it makes it equidistant. So siya nang bahala. So this is the desired length. And if you want to know more about how R really computes it, no, na paano ba niya ginagawa yan, just read through the description. So pag length dot out, equally spaced values. So that's SEQ. Two more special functions are the following. Si sequence along, SEQ underscore along, at si sequence underscore len. yung len, you can think of it as length. So, how do they differ? Si sequence along request for an atomic vector input. So, yung atomic vector, yung technical name niya, pero for brevity, I would often just call it vector. So, this function, medyo kakaiba siya kasi sequence along the vector, ano yung output niya? The output will be a sequence of integers from 1 to the number of elements in the vector. Tapos si sequence underscore len will output a sequence of integers from 1 to the specified number. So kindly type these two lines and then examine natin yung output nila. So again, just give a thumbs up if you're done typing. So from looking at the definition, perhaps hindi pa sobrang obvious what the functions are doing, but by running them, maliliwanagan tayo. Okay, so few more minutes for those who are still typing. Yung mga humahabol pa. Okay. So sequence along. Our input is a vector. And this vector contains yung numbers from 67 to 70. So if we run sequence along, it gives us 1, 2, 3, and 4 kasi this vector has 4 elements. So you might imagine a use case for this na baka parang there's something na alam nyo ilan yung elements and you want to create a vector from 1 up to the number of elements in that vector. So might be useful. And then this one, so just 1 up to 10. Ganun lang. So to create this, actually maraming options. So pwedeng yung ganito. Pwede din as described a while ago yung ginagamit, yung colon. Same output. And this is going to be a common theme naman when using R or generally in programming na even if you have the same goal, hindi lang naman strictly isa yung way to achieve that goal. So those are some special functions that you can use to create vectors, specifically numeric vectors. Now, this is something that I showed you a while ago as a teaser. Na I tried to combine a vector that I tried to combine in a vector two elements wherein one is a character and one is numeric. I tried this a while ago. You would expect na since it's a vector, it should only take heterogeneous elements. So dapat nagka-error sana But that's not what happened. And I was pointing out a while ago, let me just go back to that. I was pointing out a while ago, yun nga, ito. I'm referring to this one. Walang error message, but something happened to one. Naging character siya. So what happens is what we call coercion. Medyo violent, mabigat yung term, but yes, this is what R is using. Nako-coerce yung vector to a particular level. So yes, you can try to combine different data types in a vector, but because it's a vector and it can only have homogeneous elements, nafo-force yung iba to adjust. So the resulting vector will be coerced into the highest level, and the hierarchy looks like this. Character has the highest level. And I would say it's because character is the most flexible. You can view it that way, na siya yung pinaka-flexible. Followed by complex, followed by numeric, and then integer, and then logical is the least flexible or the lowest level. So let's look at this example. Let's make a vector called V3, and let's combine 5 elements which all have a different data type. So we have logical, we have integer, we have numeric, we have complex, we have character. And we're going to expect that the class is going to be the highest level, which is character. So para lang ma-convince tayo na ganun talaga siya gumana, so let's try this one. Kindly type the 2 lines. Thumbs up if you're done, and we'll run them. Okay, I'll give a little bit more time dun sa mga nag-type pa. Okay, so this is our third vector that's going to be stored in the environment called V3. And as I've pointed out, it contains elements of different types. And this will work, no problem, even if heterogeneous siya. But then all objects were coerced into the character class as verified here. So yung initially logical naging character, initially integer naging character, so on and so forth. So if you want to see the elements of the vector, let's say I want to see ano bang laman ni V3, just call it in the console. Yan. So all of them are really characters. So this is also a reminder to us na let's be careful kasi even if we have heterogeneous elements, a vector can still be created. So let's be mindful, ano bang types ng mga elements inside our object. So let's use the right data structure or the right object depending on the nature of our elements. So whether heterogeneous yung data types or not. Now, when it comes to our objects, merong indexing or there's a way to refer to them based on their position. There's a way to refer to the elements in those objects based on their position rather. So you're going to see this repeated for the other elements. So we're going to know, or rather for the other objects. So we're going to know how to get the index mamaya of a matrix or of a data frame, so on and so forth. So numbers enclosed in square brackets will be used to index or uniquely identify elements of the object created. And in the case of vectors, ito na-point out ko to a while ago. Yung number on the first line, rather dito, yan. Yung number dun sa first portion of a line gives you the index of the first element in that line. So ito yung first, ito yung ninth. So sample ng vector indexing. Kunyari si V3. Let's say I want to get its third element. Ganyan lang. So just put the index inside square brackets. So we're expecting an output of 2. So pag nirun natin to, and indeed we get to see 2. So I'm just introducing the concept of indexing. Na yun, na you can refer to certain elements. So this time I'm just referring to a single element because I only placed one number. But we're going to expand that further later on na you can refer to several elements. So inintroduce ko lang yung concept and this will be explored further once we go to subsetting. So that's vector indexing. Okay, time check, it's 9:51. We're going to have a short 20-minute break. So you can relax a bit and for those na hindi gaanong nakahabol kanina, you can try to catch up again. Yung YouTube link natin, pwede kayong mag-seek doon for the particular timestamp that you weren't able to catch a while ago so that you can catch up. Pwede. So we'll have that short break and I'm going to display a timer para clear sa atin kung kailan babalik. Let me just set that up. Okay, so I'm going to start this timer and we're going to resume after. Right, so before we continue, quick check lang if you're already back. Kindly react with yes, yung green with the check mark, if you're back in our Zoom session. Okay, let's wait for some of the other participants before we resume. So for around the first 2 hours or so of our training, you were able to get to know R and R Studio. And we began with the building blocks of making objects in R. So getting to know data types, and then eventually moving towards the data structures. And nasimulan na natin with vectors. Okay. So since we just resumed our session, konting refresh, mabilisang recall lang. So please go to menti.com and use the same code as a while ago. So makakita kayo ng text box there and just input your codes. Maikli lang yung magiging answers for items 1, 2, and 3. So kahit enter nyo na lang pag sumagot kayo. So yung una, tapos yung second item, and then yung third item. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to answer this. Tatlong items. If we want to create vectors that contain the following elements, what command can we use? So pwedeng hindi lang isa yung tamang sagot for some of these items. For some of these items, mukhang there is really a best way to execute it. So first, I want to create a vector with whole numbers from 1 to 30. So maganda dito, you can see the desired output and you can double check if you have a certain syntax in mind, tapos you want to check. So feel free to code it in R and verify if it looks like what's flashed on the screen right now. So una, whole numbers from 1 to 30. Second, numbers from 1 to 25, but it's spread out over 50 elements. Alin kaya dun sa mga special commands that I've shown you a while ago yung pwedeng gamitin? And then finally, the numbers from 1 to 30, but in increments of 5. So just type your codes dun sa Menti, codes nyo for items 1 to 3. So I'll give you a few minutes to answer this. Sige, I'll give you around 3 minutes to finish it. Although madami naman ng responses na pumapasok. So if you're having some issues with the Menti, you can also feel free to chat na lang sa akin. Okay, mga 1 minute na lang left to answer. Okay, so for the first item, I think karamihan yung 1 colon 30 yung naging answer. Tapos for the second item, 1 to 25 and then length dot out is equal to 50. Tapos what else? For the last item, 1 up to 30 by equals 5. So some of you even provided alternatives. That's good. So kagaya nito. So pwede din naman na ilista yung numbers as in 1 by 1. Okay, so thank you for your responses. And quick lang na demo. So ganito. By the way, to create vectors, di ba sabi kailangan ng C. Ganyan. Pero actually, this one, yung 1 colon 30 is special such that hindi na niya kailangan yung C. But if you put this, wala naman ding masama since this is the conventional way of making a vector. Pero yun, kaya niyang mag-function on its own even without C. Kaya niyang gumawa ng vector. Unlike yung mga ibang bagay na talagang, kagaya nito, it's a function talaga, or yung mga ginawa pa natin a while ago, talagang you need to enclose them inside C. Pero ito, hindi niya naman kailangan. But if you still put C, wala naman ding masama. Same output. Or this one, pwede din. And then for number 2, so 1 to 25, but spread it out over 50 elements. And finally, 1 to 30 increments of 5. So yun lang, quick recall lang ng mga special ways to make vectors. So now that we've encountered vectors, yun yung one-dimensional object with homogeneous elements, let's move to the one-dimensional object that can contain heterogeneous elements. And itong mga object na to, we call them lists. So lists can be created by using the list function. Kung kanina sa vector, C yung gamit natin, dito we use the list function. Now, since halo-halo yung laman niya, the elements to be placed inside the list, kukorek ko na lang to, inside the list are separated by commas. So let's type this in RStudio, tapos i-run natin mamaya. So kindly type, and again, just thumbs up if you're done typing. So halo-halo yan ha. You have the integers na 1 to 20, tapos may character tayo, meron tayong logical, and meron din tayong integer. So some of you are done typing, but we'll wait for the others who are not yet done. Okay. So this is our list which contains talaga namang halatang-halata heterogeneous elements. Let's run this, and you'll be able to see it here sa environment. So list 1, list of 4. Apat lang ba talaga yung laman yan? Well, technically speaking, it doesn't just contain 4 elements, pero it contains parang 4 subunits. You can think of it that way. So this one, this one, this one, and this one. So we'll examine later no na paano sila nag-interact inside the list given that they have different data types. So we'll examine that. A while ago for vectors, we only used yung square brackets to index it, to access elements by using yung number kung pang ilang element siya. That's what we did a while ago for vectors. So tingnan natin yung ating list. So I'm just going to call it here in the console, list 1. So notice, we have numbers enclosed in two pairs of square brackets, and we have numbers enclosed in just a pair of square brackets. So merong double, merong single. the double square brackets are used to identify the position of each element inside the list. So within a list, may vectors. Tapos within a vector, may respective elements sila. So how R deals with a one-dimensional object with heterogeneous elements is by combining them na parang vector, tapos next vector, ganon. So that's how a list operates. So technically, a list is a one-dimensional object. Pero ito lang yung medyo kakaiba na I don't know if it's too much to say na parang counterintuitive siya. Kasi parang if you think of a one-dimensional object, then I should just use parang isa lang yung basis ko for its address, which is merely its position. What I mean is, a while ago, for a vector, let me scroll up to that. Ito, for a vector, parang isang number lang yung basis ko nung position niya. So talagang kung pang ilan lang siya, I'm just counting. So third element, this one. Ninth element, ito. But for a list, which is supposedly a one-dimensional object, two numbers will serve as the basis for its index. Yun lang yung medyo baka magmukhang counterintuitive. Pero yun, think of a list as parang vector, another vector, another vector, kaya ganon. So, you need to refer to the vector, kung pang ilang vector, and kung pang ilang element siya within the vector. Anyway, we'll understand that better when we look at this. So, tingnan natin, what is the output of list 1? Double brackets, and then we have 1. Tapos, single brackets on 5. Single pair of brackets on 5. List 1, ganyan, and then 5. Ito yung first vector. So, kumbaga, this is the address among the vectors. Tapos, within this vector, yung fifth element. And we get 5, which you can verify here. So, fifth element in the first vector. So, yun. It's still considered technically by R as a one-dimensional object, but we need two numbers to identify a particular element. So, yun yung naging workaround ni R. So, since we're just starting out with R, it might be difficult to imagine a possible application for this. Na saan mo ba kailangan gamitin yan? But there are some advanced tools in R that heavily depend on lists. So, I don't think mas ma-explore natin yan for our sessions kasi nga beginner R level lang yung gagawin natin. But yes, there's definitely a use case for this sa R. Hindi lang gaanong halata. So, pahapyaw ko lang diniscuss yung list dahil nga ganon na we won't really encounter it that much in our 2-day session. So, were you able to follow the example? Kindly thumbs up so that we can move to the next type of object. All right. So from one-dimensional objects, let's move to two-dimensional objects. When we refer to a matrix, it's just a two-dimensional object with homogeneous elements. Kumbaga, it's a vector na two-dimensional. Parang ganon. So from vector na 1D, matrix 2D. But both of them have homogeneous elements. And to create a matrix, we use the matrix function. Another example of how self-explanatory the names of functions in R could be. So kindly type the two examples. You will notice that the two examples are almost identical except for the last part of M2. So explore natin, ano nga ba yan? Bakit magkaiba sila? In what way? So kindly type and again, just thumbs up if you're done. Sige, I'll give around 1 minute more para makahabol yung iba. Pahaba ng pahaba yung commands natin. Okay, so bago tayo mag-run, again, notice how some parts of this function kailangan parang may pangalan equals something. Whereas yung first element for both of them, wala. By the way, yung mga laman sa loob ng function, I will refer to them as arguments. Yun yung term na ginagamit to describe them. So yung what's inside the function, yun yung argument niya. Parang hawig ng argument sa math, di ba? Sa functions. Parang ganun din. So here in help, I'm going to look for matrix. The first element is actually named data. Yun talaga yung tawag sa kanya. But we can safely omit it. So kagaya ng rule of thumb that I've mentioned a while ago, na it's the first element among the first elements. So kanina kasi dun sa sequence, dalawa yun eh. So si to at si from. So first two elements. So basta nasa first part siya. So nasa first part siya. And at the same time, you can think of it as the non-negotiable object that this function needs. Now, of course, hindi ka makakagawa ng matrix if you don't have data. Specifically, yung data na yun, you can think of it as just a set of values. In our case, ito lang, which is the numbers from 1 to 16. N-row, medyo halata naman from the name, is the number of rows. And N-col, of course, is the desired number of columns. So these two matrices, yung commands natin are identical except dito kay M2, we have this additional command. I-run muna natin si M1. Tingnan natin what M1 produces. So at this point, M1 is stored in our environment. But to actually see the elements inside it, again, kailangan siyang tawagin. So M1, the elements will contain the numbers from 1 to 16 spread out over 4 rows and 4 columns. And the way it was allocated goes this way. So pababa and the next column, next column, next column. And you would observe in the next line, may command na by row equals true. Kasi ang default allocation niya is by column. But perhaps this is not what you want. So ito, by row, it will take a logical value. By default, it's false. So we're setting by row equals true so that it looks like this. So I'm going to run this line and then check natin si M2. By row na nga yung allocation niya. Ganun lang. So that's the most basic way of making a matrix. Start off from, generally speaking, a vector. And then ilagay natin ilang rows ba yung kailangan natin? Ilang columns ba? Do we want to allocate elements by row or not? Now, I'm going to copy this. Tapos I'm just going to make some quick demonstrations dito sa console. You don't have to follow along. Kahit tingnan nyo na lang siya, okay lang. May mga i-demonstrate lang ako ng mabilisan. For example, tanggalin ko to. It will actually still work. Kasi gets niya na eh, na 16 elements, 4 na row, edi 4 na columns. O di kaya, gawin kong ganito, gets na din niya. So, you can omit any one of them. Basta may isa lang na maiwan, of course. But hindi kailangan ilagay both n-row and n-col. So even if you just have one of them in the command, it will still work. as long as nagma-match yung dimension. So 16 tapos 4 as long as divisible talaga siya. What if ganito? I'm going to change this value to something like 3. 16 elements, 3 columns. Paano kaya yun? We see an output, but there is a warning message. Data length 16 is not a submultiple or multiple of the number of rows. We got an output, but there's a warning again. Anong ginagawa ng R? So R has this concept called recycling. I'm not sure if this is typical for other languages, pero parang as far as I know, isa siya sa mga medyo unique about R. It performs recycling. Since we have 3 columns and 6 rows, at this point, naubusan siya ng bala, di ba? At this point, nag-recycle siya. So start ulit ako 1 and 2. I didn't include by row equals true. That's why column-wise yung allocation ng elements. So yun lang, be careful. Make sure that the number of elements dun sa data or sa vector na gusto nyong gawing matrix will match the dimension that you want. Whether that's in terms of the number of rows or the columns. So yun lang. Dapat sure tayo na tama, na submultiple or multiple. So were you able to follow this example on matrices? Kindly thumbs up. So quick question lang dito, what are the arguments? Again, yung data, or in our case, it's a vector na gagawin mong matrix, the dimensions, and then this option. If you want it to be true. By default, it's false. So kung false, hindi na kailangan ilagay. I-assume niya na yun. Now, kapag may mga two-dimensional objects tayo, one common application for them is in terms of parang data. Tabular data specifically. So maybe you want to add names to the rows or the columns. And to add labels to them, well, again, very descriptive ang ating function. So we can use the row names and the column names, or rather call names, the call names function. So kindly type these 2 lines and then i-run natin. Tapos check natin, saan ba na-apply yung row names and yung column names. So I'm just going to fix the typo. Rest assured na yung makita ninyo dun sa ibibigay na slides will be fixed na. So after the trainings, ibibigay naman sa inyo yung slides as well as yung codes. Yan na nawala yung slide, sorry. Ayun, here. So kindly thumbs up if you're done typing. Tapos while some of you are still typing, in our sessions later, hindi pa naman ngayon, pero perhaps in the afternoon, I think, I'm going to divide my screen into two. Kaya yung slides ko hindi siya naka-wide eh. Naka-square format siya. Para mas madaling sundan na yung slides alongside the codes and hindi na ako sobrang mahirapan with switching from one window to another. So ganun tayo mamaya. Ngayon kasi medyo manageable pa, pero later I think it would be more useful, it would be more helpful for you to see na mabilis ng ganun. Na hindi na ako nag-switch ng sinishare na screen na full view. Split ko na lang siya. So for these two lines, we can select both of them. Tapos run na natin sila at the same time. So technically, nagmumukhang parang, di ba, we're running a block. Pero technically talagang pinapadala natin siya sa console to be executed. And R will still run it line by line naman. Kumbaga, by batch lang natin siyang sinisend. Pero line by line pa din naman talaga niya ini-execute. So for us to see how this was applied to our objects, tawagin natin sa M1. Now, looking at M1, you can see how the rows have names. And looking at M2, yung columns naman yung may names. So you can use these commands in case you want to apply names to rows or to columns. Hindi naman yan something na parang kailangan gawin all the time when you're using a matrix. Now, moving on to indexing. Since matrices are two-dimensional objects, we need two numbers to identify a particular element inside the matrix. And specifically, ang kailangan natin is to provide the row and the column of the element that we want to access. So ito yung pinapoint out ko a while ago about list, na yung list ay one-dimensional na object, pero dalawa yung numbers na ginagamit natin. Yun lang yung medyo sabi ko nga na it might be a bit counterintuitive. Pero dito sa matrices, dahil two-dimensional siya, dalawang numbers, and row and column yung kailangan natin. The row will always come first. So inside square brackets, row number, comma, column number. Pwedeng may space, pwedeng kagaya dito sa example ko, walang space. So let me switch to RStudio and type ko lang siya dito. M2. So let's apply the index on M2. Tapos third row, fourth column. This is M2. Third row, fourth column. Rather, ito. Third row, fourth column. We're expecting an output of 12. Yun, 12. Now, I have another example. Paano kung M2, comma, 4? So, what happened here? Wala tayong nilagay na index for the row, but we have an index for the column. So what's going to happen, since walang in-specify na row, R will assume that you want the elements from all rows. You only placed a restriction on the column. Ganun siya. And similarly, pwedeng ganito. Naglagay ako ng index for the row, hindi ako naglagay ng index for the column. So it's going to give me 5, 6, 7, and 8. As expected, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And that's how matrix indexing works. So were you able to follow this example? Pa-thumbs up na lang if yes. Alright. Para mas ma-internalize, ma-internalize natin kung paano gumagana yung matrix function. So this might be helpful eventually. Sabi ko nga magandang may solid foundation tayo sa basics. So kindly go back to our Mentimeter page. So if you're having some issues with accessing this, okay lang kahit i-chat nyo na lang yung sagot sa akin. We're going to have 3 items. So these 3 items will help improve your understanding of how the matrix function works. And at the same time, bukod pa dun, parang as a general concept, ano yung effect if we tweak some of the arguments inside a function. So makikita nyo anong tweak yung dinedescribe ko once you see the questions. So I would say na parang yung takeaway nito is not only applicable to matrices. Na yung hindi na natin siya specifically titingnan in the next sessions. But for your curiosity, magandang alamin din kung ano yung mangyayari if we do the following. So this is something nga na hindi lang applicable dito. Okay, may mga hahabol pa ba? Okay, so this is the first item. Ito yung sinasabi ko na examine what happens kapag may mga tinitweak tayong arguments sa function. Number 1, except for by row, can we omit argument labels in the matrix function? So to find out the answer, compare the outputs of this na walang argument labels and of this. Yun yung ibig sabihin ko. So yun dinidescribe ko na you might have some tweaks. Yun. So may mga nakahabol pa. I'm going to start the countdown. So pipili lang kayo between yes and no. Mahaba yung time dyan. Medyo mahaba kasi you can run the codes. Pero kung lahat nakasagot na even before the time's up, okay na. Magko-close naman na yung question dito. So again, this is something that you can eventually explore later on, even for other functions. Dito lang natin siya medyo tinututukan to demonstrate it for the matrix function. So sa mga iba pa nating ma-encounter, we won't do this anymore. Pero for your own curiosity, kasi syempre I'm presenting mga syntax sa inyo and since you're just learning, yun yung susundin nyo. But you might want to try, di ba, na anong effect if you do certain tweaks. Okay, we're just waiting for a few participants to put their answer. Again, okay lang kung walang access sa Menti. You can answer via chat. Wag lang to everyone. Ano kayang tamang sagot? Can we omit argument labels? Since 3 questions to, and I've configured it in such a way na faster answers get higher points. So you're going to see a leaderboard mamaya. Unfortunately, wala akong prize para sa winner. Bragging rights lang siguro. Okay, 23 versus 6. The correct answer is yes. So, pwede nyo i-double check yun doon. Na if you try the commands that I've specified in the slides, confirm nyo, you get the same output. Okay. Next item. Can we rearrange the positions of the arguments if they are labeled? When I presented the syntax to you, I was just following yung prescribed arrangement based on the documentation. So if they are labeled, can we rearrange their positions? Compare the outputs of the following two sets of codes. So ito, data and row and call. Yun yung order nila. And that's how I've shown it before. Versus ito, nauna si enrow followed by encall, data yung last when all this time siya yung first nating nilalagay. So what will happen if we rearrange the positions of the arguments provided that they're labeled? Pwede kaya yun or hindi? So I've started the countdown sa Mentimeter. Medyo iniklian ko yung time limit. I think enough na yung time na sinet ko. Wow, ang bilis ng answers. One minute left for those who haven't answered yet. Kaya pang humabol? $25 versus 3. And the answer is yes. So, totoo naman that R has yung parang prescribed na syntax niya when you look at the documentation na ito yung order. But if you rearrange the arguments as long as they're labeled, based on the example that I've asked you to try, nag-work naman. So it's still good to follow the default order. But in case medyo nagkakamali tayo minsan and we forgot to follow that order, nag-work naman kung may labels. Okay, we're now about to go to the last question. And iiklaan ko yung time limit. I think kaya naman na binawasan ko ng 1 minute yung time limit. And this is the last question. A twist on number 2. Can we rearrange the positions of the arguments if they are not labeled? Compare the outputs of the following. So hindi naman ganun ka-wild yung pag-rearrange na ginawa ko. In the sense that both the data is placed dun sa first part. But I've swapped some items there. So hindi nga malinaw ano yung 2. So is 2, ano ba yan, number ng ano or whatever. Kasi di ba 4 siya a while ago. So can we rearrange the positions if they're not labeled? And the answer for this one is no. So dun pumapasok yung importance ng mga labels. Lalo na dun sa mga arguments ng functions natin. Na lalo na yung arguments na hindi sila non-negotiable, as I would call it. Kagaya nitong data na non-negotiable to. Pero yung iba, so if medyo nagsuswap tayo ng positions, nagmamatter yung labels. And this is true not only for the matrix function, but for other functions as well. So let's move on to data frames. Etong data frames, you can think of them as similar to matrices in the sense na yung thinking na you have a row and a column, ganun din naman, being a two-dimensional object. But this time, we can allow for heterogeneous elements. By the way, yung matrices, since homogeneous elements sila, yung principle nung pagko-coerce will also apply to them. So as a side note, nakagaya nung sa vectors na we forced some elements na hindi naman pareho yung type, but we were still able to create a vector. Ganon din sa matrices. And the same hierarchy follows. Yung pinakita ko a while ago na character followed by complex, numeric, integer, logical. That will follow. However, for data frames, going back, there is a restriction on the heterogeneity. Elements within a column should be homogeneous. But elements between columns need not be of the same data type. That's because yung perspective ng data frame is yung parang typical perspective when you're dealing with tabular data. The rows are observations. So the elements between columns, or in other words, the elements ng mga rows don't have to be of the same type, but the columns are thought to be variables. Ganun yung typical perspective when dealing with tabular data. So the elements within a column should be homogeneous. If your column contains age, edi puro numbers yun. If your column contains names, edi puro characters yun. So that's the restriction on heterogeneity. Data frames are created using the data.frame function. So kung sa matrix function, sa data frame, data.frame. So be careful, may dot yun. So hindi lang data frame na tuloy-tuloy. Now, how do we input the elements inside this function? We proceed by placing each column vector-wise. Anyway, gagawin naman natin yun. Once we go to importing data, we're going to do that this afternoon. You're going to see that datasets imported in R are by default considered as data frames. Yun yung assumption niya agad when you import data. So let's do this. Data 1, gagawa tayo ng ganong object. And using the data.frame function, we're specifying a vector containing names, tapos containing age, containing height. Para maayos siya tingnan, the way I've presented it here is nag-enter ako. But feel free to type them all in one line. Okay lang. Walang masama kung isang line lang. Pero if you want it to be easier to read, wala namang masama if you enter. R will still consider this as one line. Yun pa din naman yung iisipin niya kasi yung kapartner na parenthesis nito is over here. So, susuyurin niya yung function hanggang sa mahanap niya yun. Kaya, okay lang. Yung enter, parang, yung pag-enter for aesthetics lang yun. Parang nga mas maaliwala siya basahin. And it's not too crowded all on the same line. So kindly type this in R. Medyo mahaba yan. And I would ask you again to react using thumbs up to indicate if you're done typing. Ay sayang, fail. Hindi ko pala napakita yung ending nung questions a while ago na may scores yun eh. Bago tayo mag-demo nung data frame, papakita ko quickly. Kindly try to finish in around 2 minutes. May mga tapos na, but I think less than half pa lang. And I understand, mahaba yung codes this time around compared to a while ago. Let me just switch to our studio. So ito separate yung aking vectors, but if you prefer to have them all in one line, okay lang din. Side note ko na lang din, typically, hindi naman tayo yung ganito na nag-enter talaga ng data sa R na as in mano-mano, na we input yung columns na parang ganito. More often than not, what we do is we import data. Pinapakita ko lang how to create it from scratch para lang aware din kayo. And that has been the flow naman of the discussion simula pa nung sa vectors eh. How to create it from scratch. But once you use R for data analysis, often you work with data that's imported from other sources. So pwedeng CSV files or yung mga spreadsheets from MS Excel or something coming from other software then like Stata or SPSS. Okay, I think we can proceed with running this line. Hindi ko i-highlight tong buong to. I will just put my cursor here. And then, na-consider na ni R yun na mula siya dito hanggang dito. Okay, you can work that way. Hindi sobrang important yung spacing except for characters. So when it comes to your codes, medyo okay lang yung may mga ganyan tayong ginagawa to make the codes appear easier on the eye. Kesa yung kung one line nga yan na ang haba, di ba? At least dito malinaw, this is my first column, this is my second column, this is my third column. And each of the columns, lahat sila, were constructed out of vectors. So our data frame, si data 1, is now present in environment. If you want to view the resulting dataset, you can use the view function. Take note this has a capital V, or click on the dataset or the data frame doon sa environment. Ano ba yung mangyayari? Let's say I just call data 1, ganyan lang. Lalabas naman din. Pero, when we use the view function with a capital V, may mas magandang viewer na magagamit tayo. Kasi ito, imagine, maayos siya ngayon since I only have a few elements. But what if you have a data frame with 1,000 elements, di ba? Would it be good to see it all printed in the console? So itong view function will give us this viewer na slightly, di ba, mas maayos compared to this. And you can even have some preliminary exploration ng data. Pwede kayong mag-sort using yung buttons. May filter option din. Ayan, may mga ganyan kayong pwedeng gawin. So to access this viewer, either yung command or click lang. So pag kinlik nyo, actually, ini-execute din naman niya yung code na yon. But that is if you want to take advantage of RStudio's point-and-click interface. So yes, capital V yung view. Capital V, it's case sensitive. Now, what will happen if we did not name the vectors in our data frame? Okay, for this one, kahit di nyo na lang sundan, kasi I will tweak the version of data 1 that's saved in my environment. So kahit wag nyo siyang sundin, ipapakita ko lang para safe na yung data sa inyo. Ako na lang yung mag-a-apply nung change. What if hindi natin siya pinangalanan? Going back to this view, malinaw na may name yung columns natin. Even dito pa lang, malinaw, may name yung columns natin. What if inalis ko yun? And I just put the vectors. Gumawa ng name si R. But if you look at the names that are generated, hindi siya ganun kaganda. So you would have to improve this. So if you create data from scratch, edi pangalanan nyo na yung columns. Pangalanan nyo na yung vectors na ini-input nyo. Yan. Compared dun sa kanina na ang complicated and hindi descriptive yung names ng columns na ginawa ni R. So if we did not name the vectors, R will provide a name for it, but it doesn't look good. May automatic way siya to create those names. Similar to matrices, we can add labels to the rows and columns of our data frame using, I will correct this pag sinend ko yung slides, using the same functions as a while ago. Yung row names and call names, not column names. Hindi ko na siya muna ide-demo. Bakit hindi ko muna ide-demo? First, the way we created our dataset a while ago, by default may column names na. Tapos yung pag-change nito, itong mga bagay na to, it will be presented, parang it will be reframed in a different perspective pag pumunta tayo dun sa aspect na basic data management. Pero ito lang talaga yun, essentially. This is what we're going to do eventually when we get to that part. Now, moving on to indexing. Like matrices, dahil 2 dimensions, we need 2 numbers to identify a particular element inside a data frame. The syntax is similar. Ganun-ganun din na you have the brackets tapos I, comma, J. And actually, yung mga nakita natin a while ago, mag-a-apply pa din na what if wala ito, walang I, but you have J? Or walang J, but you have a value for I? That will still apply. However, ito yung additional advantage ng paggamit ng data frame. We can also use the dollar symbol to refer to a particular column by its name. Thinking of a data frame as yung typical tabular dataset, imagine niyo you have a dataset na, let's say, ang daming columns. Let's say, meron kayong column na yung pangalan ay height, pero in that dataset, siya yung, kunyari, pang 17 na column. Hindi ba mas madaling tandaan that the column is named height than the column is yung pang 17 siya? So yun yung advantage ng data frame. We can use this dollar symbol to refer to a particular column by using its name. So to demonstrate that, papakita ko data 1, $sign. Ito yung maganda din. May auto-completion na din. Pinapakita na sa atin yung possible options. Let's say age. Kapag ito lang, so data 1, $sign age, of course, it's going to show us all values for age. Kasi wala na tayong parang further indexing na ginawa. We're just calling the variable or the column name itself. So it's going to show us everything in that column. Now, the output of this is a vector. So dahil vector yun, parang nagpapatong-patong na yung indexing. So you can index yung column from the data frame. And within this output, pwede kang mag-index, let's say, yung pangalawa lang. So we're expecting to get 21. Yun. So that's how we index a data frame. Pwede din naman, let's say, balikan natin si data 1. It looks like this. Si 21 ay nasa second row, second column. So pwede din naman yung ganito. And you're going to get 21. So pwedeng parang matrix-like yung indexing. Pwedeng yung ganito na you're referring to a column using its name rather than kung pang ilang column siya. Nasundan ba yung example on data frame indexing? Kindly thumbs up. So we'll explore how to work with a data frame later on. Lalo pat yung data frame na object, yan talaga yung default na treatment ni R when it comes to datasets. Diyan iikot sa pag-manipulate, sa pag-tweak ng mga elements ng data frame, diyan iikot yung session natin this afternoon. Okay, itong arrays, as I've mentioned a while ago while I was describing yung mga types ng objects that can be created in R, medyo hindi madaling isipin kung saan siya ginagamit. Kasi you can have a one-dimensional object, tapos you can have a two-dimensional object na kailangan ko pa ba ng more dimensions? But sometimes there could be some applications where this could be helpful. Na you have an n-dimensional object with, yun nga lang, ito yung restriction, with homogeneous elements. And it's created using the array function. So dahil mahirap mag-visualize ng, let's say, paano ba ang isang 4-dimensional object, di ba? Parang ano ba yun? So the way this works, yung dimensions niya ay number ng rows, number ng columns, tapos parang isi-spread out niya yun over matrices. Medyo kakaiba siya gumalaw. Anyway, tingnan natin yung example na to. So kindly type this and let's examine ano yung gagawin niya dito sa vector na may 1 up to 9 tapos 10 to 18 and I provided the following dimensions, 3, 3, and 2. Pa-thumbs up na lang if you're done. So this is our object, array 1. Tapos, run natin and we're going to see it in the environment. Kapag kinol ko siya here in the console, meaning I want to see what it contains, ito yung itsura niya. Ito yung unang vector na pinasok ko dun sa array. Elements na 1 up to 9. Tapos may pangalawang set ako dito na 10 to 18. So ang ginawa, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. First 3 by 3 matrix. Kasi yung last dimension refers to the number of matrices that will be created. Tapos yung pangalawang matrix, edi si 10 to 18. So in effect, parang may tatlong dimensions. And we need 3 numbers to identify a particular element inside an array. So yung row number, column number, matrix number. Yun lang. So 2 commas na. I-type na lang natin siya ng mabilisan lang. So first type is comma, comma, at may 1 sa dulo. So we're only referring to the first matrix. Ay, sorry, array 1. Ayan. So first matrix without any filtering or restriction kung pang ilang row or column, edi yung buong matrix yung in-output niya. Paano kung maglalagay ako ng restriction? Copy-paste ko lang to. Gawin kong second column. So 4, 5, 6. Tapos what if may number sa row, walang number sa column, may number sa matrix? First row, 1, 4, and 7. And then finally, paano kung ganito? Array 1, may 1 dito, comma, comma. Sorry. Comma and comma. Ano kaya yung i-output niya? So it's going to give us the first row from both matrices. So ganun yung indexing ng array. And notice, medyo nga napakapahapyaw lang nung discussion ko kasi hindi naman siya talaga magagamit in our next sessions. But I still wanted you to know how this type of object is used. And that's the end of the second chapter. So it was all about getting to know the types of objects in R. At this point, do you have any questions? yung last 2 chapters natin, remember may 4 chapters tayo for our morning session. Yung last 2 chapters natin, mas maikli naman sila ng DHAMAC compared to the second chapter. So I think we're on track to finish before lunchtime. So far, so good. So medyo malaki yung progress na from being total beginners for some of you na talagang walang exposure sa R, 'di ba? Na ang laki na ng progress, nakakagawa na kayo ng objects. So there's a question here na kailan daw ginagamit yung parentheses and brackets. So parenthesis daw ba is for functions and then if element-related brackets, that's correct. So pag parenthesis is never used in indexing. So talagang sa function siya, generally speaking. Tapos yung brackets, yun yung main use niya for indexing. Yes, that's how it works in R. Another question. Okay, interesting question and it's a workflow related question. So sabi, the script panel, the one on the upper left part, seems like a sandbox. But in real life, is it the console that we truly work in all the time? Based on my personal experience, I would say it's a mix of both. Na totoo, yes, the script panel looks like your sandbox na you can test yung syntax na pinatype nyo dyan, kung tama ba, you can put initial codes. Parang teka, parang naano ko yung sige, I'm going to discuss the question. Kasi parang may dalawang sense yung term na, ito kasi yung last part, is it the console that we truly work in all the time? First interpretation ko is that dun ba ako nagtatrabaho, like as a user? Ako kasi parang personally, na I would draft my codes, tapos parang if I want to quickly check something like, kunyari, I want to quickly look at this, so ilalagay ko siya sa console. I will work in the console. Pero parang yung final codes ko nasa script. Second interpretation ng work is the way R works on the codes. So yung tanong, is it the console that we truly work in all the time? So yes, everything in R is executed in the console. So I hope I was able to answer the question. Yung script parang lagayan lang ng code. Essentially, it's like a notepad. Pero for things to run, kailangang dumaan sa console. Ganon siya. Okay, another question. Before I move to the next question, so may analogy na kung sa Stata, script is the command window. I'm not sure sa pangalan. Let me just quickly check. Hindi ko sobrang memorize yung names ng mga interface. Sa Stata, command is yung medyo kahawig ng script, I would say, sa Stata is yung anong tawag doon? Data editor. No, not data. Do file editor. Sorry, yun. Do file sa RStudio and sa R, nandun na siya sabay. Yun. Another question. On what specific instances shall we index particular elements? And would this help create subgroups within the entire dataset? Doon tayo papunta, yes. Parang building blocks natin na given a general object, paano ako mag-access ng element? But when we look at it in the context of data management or dealing with data, Doon tayo papunta, yes. Creating subgroups or subsets within a dataset. Interesting question so far. Meron pa ba before we move to the next chapter? Okay, looks like we can move on to the next chapter. Basic operations. First set of operations are arithmetic operators. By default, R implements PEMDAS with left to right associativity. And I think yan naman yung default dun sa mga programming languages. Before I move on to this, may additional question na very interesting din. So magandang i-address ko din to bago tayo mag-move on. So the question is, can we uninstall R already and retain RStudio? Ito yung hierarchy. Mas important si R kay RStudio. R is the programming language itself. So RStudio will not work kung walang R sa computer. But R will work kahit walang RStudio. Hindi nga lang ganun ka-user-friendly yung interface, pero pwedeng-pwede siyang gamitin. So, kung may RStudio kayo, hindi pwedeng i-uninstall si R. RStudio runs on top of R. So, kung may RStudio, both R and RStudio should be installed. So, the operations, yung mga arithmetic operations, similar syntax lang naman like sa Excel or sa ibang languages. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. For exponentiation, we have two options. Pwedeng dalawang asterisk or the caret symbol. Tapos modulus to output the remainder after division, and integer division kung whole part lang yung gusto nating makita from the quotient. So, madali lang namang gamitin yan kung numbers lang, but I want to demonstrate how R uses it in vectors. Diba? Na, wow, pwede palang gawin ni R yun, na vectors yung a-applyan niya ng mga operators na yan. And the operations will be done element-wise. Kindly type these codes. Ayan, medyo mahaba-haba na yung codes natin, and give me a thumbs up reaction if you're done. Basically, we're creating two vectors called X and Y. And we're applying all of those operations described in the previous slide on those vectors. For those na tapos na and kung naka-open pa yung Mentimeter nyo, I've displayed the leaderboard na. Nakalimutan ko kanina. Medyo close naman yung mga highest scores. we have here our first vector, si x. So as I've mentioned a while ago, kahit wala ng c, okay lang kapag ganito, yung nakakolon. So x is in our environment. Tapos y, nandun na din, 10 to 100 by 10, by increments of 10. So naka-sequence lang yan. So successively, i-run ko lang yung mga lines. And you'll be able to see na element-wise ngang pina-perform yung operations. Addition, subtraction, tapos multiplication, division, tapos exponentiation. Itong dalawa will have the same output. Then this one is yung to get the modulus. Tapos integer division. Ito yung normal na division. Tapos 0 yung whole part for all of them. Yun yung mga basic arithmetic operators. The next set of operators are called relational operators. Basically, nagko-compare ng values. Let me just set up my screen. I-switch ko yung display type ko. Here. Yan. So we're going to work on our x vector pa din. X and y vectors. X greater than y. Anong magiging output? This will give us logical values. Element-wise pa din. Since all of the values in our x vector, lahat talaga sila ay mas maliit compared to the values in our y vector, so we got false. Tapos pag x less than y, of course, baliktad lang. Ito, to check for equality. Pwedeng may space, pwedeng wala. Ayan. To check for equality, alam naman natin that x and y talagang magkaiba yung elements. So, ganun yung output. Tapos, ito, may greater than or equal. Tapos, less than or equal. And finally, not equal to. So these will output logical values and operate element-wise. Final set of operators are called logical operators. These operate on logical values. So, iisipin natin na parang how will we apply it using the x and y vectors? Eh, di ba yung x and y numeric? So, paano natin ma-apply yung logical operators sa current example natin? So, logical negation, logical and, at saka logical or. Notice, for negation, isang symbol lang yung binibigay na option sa atin. But for and or, pwedeng isang symbol lang, ampersand for and, tapos vertical bar for or pwedeng doblehin yun. The shorter forms perform element-wise operations, which is what we typically want, while the longer forms examine only the first element of each vector. Some examples. Itong x less than y, as we saw it a while ago, ito siya. It contains logical values. So pag nag-apply tayo nung negation, parang i-flip lang niya yun eh. Gagawin lang niyang false. So yun. This function is applied on a set of logical values. Lang niya yung signs, or rather yung values nito. Magiging true lang lahat yan. How about this one? X greater than y and x less than y. ito si greater than, ito si less than. Since and yan, sa logic, para maging true, dapat parehong true yung ini-end natin, yung dalawang objects na yon. X greater than y, lahat ng laman niya false. X less than y, laman niya lahat true. So what we're going to see, lahat false. Tapos itong longer form, isa lang yung output niya. Since it's only based on the first elements of each vector. So medyo weird, di ba, na bakit yan nag-exist? But sometimes may mga napagagamitan yan. But more often than not, ito yung form na kailangan natin. So at this point, the examples are quite abstract, pero eventually we're going to apply this na mas ma-appreciate natin yung importance of using logical operators. Any questions about chapter 3? So maikli lang siya. And the last chapter is even going to be shorter than that. Okay, we can proceed to our last chapter. This last chapter is somehow an extension of indexing as described a while ago. So, nakita natin kung paano gamitin yung brackets, di ba, na naglalagay tayo ng numbers inside them. And generally speaking, R follows a certain syntax when extracting elements from various objects. And one way, as we saw a while ago, is by using square brackets. And in general, we append square brackets to the name of the object that we are subsetting. Yun yung ginagawa natin kanina. Diba? Na we append the brackets to the name of the object. Kagaya nito. Ang daming pwedeng i-input sa loob ng square brackets. Kanina, we only dealt with positive integers. That's all that we have used. And the positive integers, when we use them inside square brackets, we get an output that returns elements at specified positions. Actually, we can also use negative integers. So if positive integers will return elements, negative integers will omit elements. Logical expressions, pag yun yung input natin, we get elements for which yung corresponding logical value is true. If we don't put anything inside square brackets, it will return the entire object. Kasi wala kang pinerform na subsetting doon by doing that, na wala kang nilagay inside square brackets. If you input 0 inside square have names. Kasi by default, wala namang names yung elements, but we can add names to them. Let's say using row names, call names, di ba? May ganun tayong ginawa a while ago. And if you input a numeric vector, we get elements in the corresponding positions. So medyo mahabang listahan to. It may be a lot to absorb instantly. And of course, mas maganda if you see this in action. Remember data 1. Data 1 is the data frame that we have created a while ago. Ito si name, si age, at si height. So kindly type the following lines. Then i-run natin sila line by line to really see ano yung magiging effect if we have the following different ways or different types of objects inside our square brackets. So please be careful about the pairs ng brackets, about the parentheses, about the commas. So kindly type the lines first, tapos pa-thumbs up again if you're done. I-run natin yan ng line by line. So before I proceed with this demonstration to run each line, keep in mind how data 1 looks like. Okay, it looks like this. So data 1, positive integer na 2, second row. Kasi first index is for the row. And that's what we got. Data 1, negative 2 will omit the second row. Ito, data 1, tapos inside, meron kang logical statement. So, parang gina-judge mo, may relational operation that will output either true or false. Sino lang ba yung mga greater than 20 yung age? Actually, isang row lang yung nagmamatch, which is si Bob. So this one is telling us na mag-filter ka ng row for which yung age niya is greater than 20. And we get Bob. Tapos ito, medyo mahaba siya. Tapos, I have the OR operator. Either greater than 20 yung age or less than 160 yung height. So both conditions don't have to hold. Either one lang. So 20, greater than 20 yung age or less than 160 yung height. We're going to see two elements. So medyo mahaba yan kasi whenever we refer to age dito, we always need to refer to data 1 kasi walang kilala si R na age na independent object. Ang alam lang niyang age is the one inside data 1. Kaya ang haba nung line na ito. And even this. It's because of yung reference ng mga column names natin to the data frame. Tapos sabi kapag walang laman yung square brackets, we get everything. Kapag 0 yung laman, effectively nabura yung dataset. But take note, hindi natin in-apply yung changes dun sa actual dataset. Untouched to. So parang nag-extract lang tayo ng elements. Hindi natin in-overwrite whatever progress na nagawa natin a while ago. Now, using a character. When you're using a character, since may name yung columns natin, then we can filter by name. Segue. Kahawig yan nito. Pero dine-demonstrate ko lang kasi sa portion na to na everything is done using square brackets. And then finally, using a numeric vector. Sa rows, I have 1 and 3 selected. And that's the output that I get. By the way dito, pwedeng character vector. I-demo ko lang quickly. What if hindi lang height? I'm also going to include, let's say, name. Pwede din. So I'm just showing you basic subsetting using square brackets. Definitely, there will be easier ways to subset your data without resorting to this. Kasi when you want yung mga medyo complex na conditions, I would say there are better ways. And you're going to see yung isang way mamaya sa afternoon session natin. Kasi for example, ito, nagusto ko lang namang kunin yung observations na older than 20 tapos shorter than 160 centimeters yung height. Eh, ang haba nung syntax na to. So there will be better ways. Pero ito lang na kahit yung knowledge nyo at this point is just about using square brackets, madami na kayong pwedeng gawin. And even if you have one goal, ang daming ways to go about it. Ang dami-dami nyo ng options na pwedeng gamitin. So that's it for basic subsetting. And we're going to have an improved way to obtain subsets this afternoon. Oh, may question na agad. So if you have other questions, feel free to chat. Okay, what does it mean daw when a white cross on a red circle appears beside the line in the script, even if you type the command correctly? So si R kasi, parang si R Studio rather, parang may real time siyang checking kung tama yung tina-type natin. Hindi ko siya mapagana this time. Pero minsan parang ayun, ayun. Okay. Na kahit hindi ka pa nga tapos, pero nag-a-assume siya na incomplete yung tina-type mo. So may alert lang. So you need to put a closing bracket. Kung parang if you're sure na you're finished typing, tapos may X pa din, in my experience, sometimes late lang siya naaalis. Pero eventually, may realize niyang tama naman yung syntax. Kasi so far, scrolling up, lahat naman ng lines ko ay walang X. Syntax-wise, tama naman tayo. Other questions? Okay, so that ends our first session. We're going to have a 1-hour lunch break, and pagbalik natin mamaya, we're not going to dive into the second session right away. May konting recap pa din naman to refresh us about what we've learned this morning. And kagaya ng kanina, I'm going to share a timer para alam natin kung kailan tayo babalik. Okay, we'll see each other again